Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Webster. I'm the founder, CEO, and CISO for Cyvergence. And what I do at Cyvergence is I bridge business and cybersecurity. So this is a little bit different of a presentation that I've done in the past. This is a little bit back to the IT roots, but it's going to show some of the other sides of my personality, some of the other things that I can do at Cyvergence and putting things into that bigger picture. So just today, in fact, I had given this as a keynote presentation. So this presentation, From Cyber Noise to Resilient Enterprises, Why Identity and Visibility Decide Outcomes, was actually determined by the vendor that I gave the keynote for. I'll talk about that when it comes out, but I thought I would at least give you some background as to why I'm doing this video. But also, there's a lot of good stuff. And I will say it was very well received. I had a lot of people coming up and talking to me and wanted to find out a little bit more about what I do and the context and so on. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and jump into it today. So the agenda was fairly simple with this. It's the changing technology world, enter cybersecurity, because I am a cybersecurity person, and what IT and security operations need. So just a bit of the truth be told, it was a combined audience. It was both IT people and cybersecurity people. And some people thought they were in both categories, which is totally fine. But just so you understand why I'm talking about some of the things that I do. So it is a little bit different type of speech. But anyway, let's go ahead and dive in. So the changing technology world. This is just the operating world as everybody's aware of it. We had cloud, remote work, virtual desktops, all of these things, and that ecosystem is expanding faster than ever before. Teams are managing more systems anymore. The interconnections between all of this is changing like never before. Operations has cloud, SaaS, all these types of things. Users are distributed, they're remote working, virtual desktops, all of that kind of stuff. The volume of logs is also increasing. One of the quotes that I put in today was and this is old information, there were 38,000 types of cybersecurity products. Now it's exploding even more. Now that you've got vibe coding and all these other things, there are more products on the market than I have ever seen. And I keep learning about more products. I assume it's going to happen until the end of time, from my perspective. But this has a lot of different challenges with it because are you actually able to pay attention to and read some of those logs? Now, just my personal experience with things, I have brought in vendors that claim to do AI and they're doing the checking on a lot of those things. It's not always well received. They don't always cover all the different logs that are capable of being monitored or you might have in your environment. Then you throw in all the different IT tools and what business is looking for. We're not talking about just cybersecurity tools now. We're talking about logs all over the place. You know, Separating the signal from the noise is more critical than it's ever been in the past. So complexity grows faster than teams. When you start to look at things, yes, you had the cloud adoption, you had all these other things, but now you've got interconnection between a lot of these solutions. You have to make sure the logs are going. You have to make sure that you've got capabilities of monitoring things from a NOC perspective, a network operations center, then a security operations center. You've got to make sure all this stuff is working, that everybody's able to do and see what's going on. Meanwhile, you have to make sure that things are working properly from a business standpoint when a lot of this technology is not really up to snuff from today. But one of the challenges is we have more and more operational complexity and more systems to connect into. But as workers, there's a human capacity that's going on. We don't have the capability of doing and monitoring everything, getting all that stuff done. There's always too much work to do. This is just part of the reality. APIs, that gets to be a problem. In some cases, the only way to grab logs is through the API. So then you have this extra process that's being built just to go collect logs. Some systems don't even have logs. And when logs are painfully obvious that you need this across the board. Microservices, it increases interdependencies. Again, these are oftentimes found in cloud, but sometimes they're built on other types of systems. And there's a lot of nuance when it starts to get into things. Then there's the operational baseline of configuration management databases and so on. That gets to be a big challenge because you don't always know what's taking place on the application. You've got to do the best job that you can do. So let's take a step back for a minute here. Identity has been exploding. There are so many different accounts that are out there. You know, we all know about application accounts. And back in my day, when I first got started, we had, you had administrator accounts, then you had the local accounts, the standard user accounts, and then you had maybe a couple service accounts here and there. And now we have so much more. NHIs is a new term. A lot of the people had not heard of the term NHI, non-human identities, for those who are not familiar with non-human identities. These are things like the service accounts, but also covers machine identities. APIs are put in that category. And then you've got AI agents, which also can have non-human identities that are put into it. These are things that are operating on your system that may or may not be categorized for in some of the standardized processes. We'll touch more on that in a bit. And of course, you've got cloud and you've got, all these other issues that are going on. But let's take a look by the numbers because I find this very interesting. You know, in the olden days, if you had, 10 people in an organization, you had maybe 12 accounts, maybe 15 or something like that. Now, the numbers are very different. By the numbers, machine identities outnumber human identities 80 to 1. And that's from a CyberArk. So just recently, though, I was at an NHI summit, non-human identity summit. The number that was being thrown around there was 443 to 1. So you got one person organization and you've got 443 accounts. I know I'm being a little facetious there because you've got to take into account the size of the organization, what's being done, all those kind of things. But that's a lot. And here's the thing with AI agents too, when you start to take a look at that. You know, they're accelerating that trend. That's why you've got so many NHIs, according to the summit that I went to. And part of the issue is they're ephemeral accounts. If you have ephemeral accounts, that means they're there for a second and then they're gone, and maybe they'll come back. And there's also JIT. And so, a technical audience, most of you should be aware of it, but just in case, it's just in time access. So, those accounts are just in time, they're ephemeral, and then they're gone, and then there's something else that's going on. But here's a twist too with some of the AI agents, which creates some more challenges for people today. A lot of them don't necessarily connect properly into Windows. So let's take a look at it from that particular perspective. AI agents aren't connecting Windows. They aren't using identities to go get these things done. So they're relying on the development process related to those AI agents. And a lot of AI agents are non-deterministic. So what do I mean by that? If you've seen a Newton's cradle where you have the ball comes in, hit, another ball goes up, and it goes back and forth like that, that's determinism. It hits, you have the physics going in there, there's in and out. When you're talking about AI, it may or may not do that. It might do that most of the time, but it might decide to change its whole process. So I was reading an article somewhat recently, and the article was talking about how AI, they had all these checks, and you had AI checking AI, but the problem from an AI perspective is they aren't necessarily monitoring everything that's going on. That's a problem. And they'll also agree exactly with whatever they're saying. So they're there to counter the original AI. It goes in and checks it and says, yes, we agree with you. Let's go ahead and delete production. What? you know, these are big problems. Are you okay with that? A lot of times we don't have human in the loop because there's so much happening so quickly that they don't even want to have human in the loop. I was reviewing a product. Somebody was telling me about the product of their company the other day. And the way the product worked, they had like 220 different agents that were running around doing different things, and they had no human in the loop. Humans couldn't decide, hey, let's validate whether that's okay or not. I personally am not okay with it. Now, if it's something that can go down quickly, you can bring it back quickly, and it has no business impact in a situation like that, maybe it's not that important. Cool, go ahead and do that. But understand those business risks when you are starting to work in situations like that. But all this tells you that there is so much going on from an identity standpoint. It is getting more and more complex than you've ever seen. So let's get into the NOC, the Network Operations Center. And this is taken from Big Panda. I don't know much about that particular company, but they said there were 9.6 million events annually on average. And of course, it's depending on the size of the organization, et cetera. But they said 18% of IT operations alerts are actually actioned. So there's an alert, a number of them are being checked on, but a lot of them are not. But here's the key point that they were pointing out. Over 80% of operational alerts don't have any value. Now, I have been in organizations like this. I have seen how bad this can be. So from when you're looking at this, I was going over and checking with somebody once, and they had thousands and thousands and thousands of things. I said, well, how do you know what's going on in your organization? How do you know if an alert is important or not when all you had was just a piece of information and thousands of alerts hitting there? To me, that has very little value. I would say that probably 99 plus percent of the alerts they were doing absolutely nothing with. You know, and these problems we still hear about today. I mean, now we've got some things filtering things out, but clearly we don't have enough operational alerts to figure out what's going on. But even looking over, hey, what's going on from your side? I at least want to check into this. Well, why even bother with alerts? Just go ahead and, grep through logs and try to find things in order to get things done. That's how you'd want to look at it if that's the status of your log program. So SOC alerts, Security Operations Center alert, just in case you're not familiar. Uh, Many alerts still need human validation. You have to go through and check some of the stuff. Yes, AI is able to do some stuff and there is some magic and things like that. But quite often, most organizations have poor correlation going on. They're not checking to see what's going on. Lack of context. So here's a couple things I'm going to say, and this is a problem both on the IT side of the house and in the cybersecurity side of the house. And so I'm going to pick on both sides, both teams there. Most organizations don't really understand or know what they're dealing with. They might know that it's related to a particular system and the system might do X, Y, or Z, but they don't really know what the value is from a business standpoint. Nobody's looking at it and going, that seems like a really good idea. There's a lot of challenges to that. So when you see the alerts, you don't really know, is this high priority or is this critical priority or low priority? And of course, it depends on the context and the environment and stuff like that. But if you don't know the business priority, what is really that risk? That's a challenge that I have. Too many tools and changing output of information. This is a problem that's as old as the hills. For example, even like firewall logs, when I was working with a company that had a SOC, some big name company would just change their logs, and all of a sudden the logs would be completely different than the logs that they had before. Well, then you have absolutely no visibility for what's going on in the organization. And visibility is so critical. You don't have visibility. What are you doing? Like, I'll give an example. Equifax is a very good example. And you go back and look at their breach in 2017, what happened? From some of the data and stuff that I've read on it, TLS certificates, they did not update those, so they were expired. It meant that they didn't update some of the other things, and it meant that they couldn't actually read any of the logs for anything that was going outbound to their organization from an intrusion detection system standpoint. You're blind once again. You don't know if you've got an issue, and that could be an issue for your organization. These are massive problems that people are facing. Clearly, I mean, we have these types of problems. And the reality is today is the same sort of thing. The logs are changing. We're hearing with a lot of the AI tools from the CISOs that I speak with, they have no context. And then they find the logs are changing on them. Well, here's our system this week. They said, oh, no, let's have a completely different system the following week. It's a little bit better than that, but you're talking about once a month, once every couple of months with some of the systems. But if you've got systems that are changing the whole output, changing the format of the logs, changing the application, and they're deciding this is important versus that is important, how do you have any symmetry? How do you know what's going on? How do you know the SOC is picking up and reading things properly? This is painful, really, really painful. And these are issues a lot of IT people are having to deal with. But yeah, it's definitely problematic. Here's some statistics in an AI SOC from the state of AI and security operations. just under 1,000 alerts per day. So you get all these different alerts, but 40% of the alerts are never investigated. This doesn't surprise me at all. What does surprise me here is 57% of companies suppress detection rules. Now, I want to be very honest about that. I have suppressed detection rules. For example, I needed to have this. We're getting an alert. We go investigate it. It was a waste of time. We'd get nothing out of it. I said, if this particular alert sequence comes in as a result of this compound set of actions that are taking place, can you let us know if we expand one more hop? Absolutely. Cool. Then block it because we're just wasting operational time. And I have no desire to waste operational time in this context. This is going to save us money and it's not a waste of time. So that is a legitimate use of suppressing detection rules. However, I have to think that there are other companies out there that are suppressing detection rules for the wrong reasons. And I asked how many people have that. And there's some people nodding their heads in the audience that they know they shouldn't be suppressing them, but they are. And these are really big issues. And I got a little bit into a case where somebody had told me that there was a vendor, but they had found a compromised organization. They knew that they had advanced persistent threats. These are advanced threat actors inside of their environment. The CISO had told them, delete everything. The CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, said the entire team would be fired if we release this information. So he decided to hide everything, just sweep it under the carpet. You're getting into fiduciary duty issues in cases like that. Now, I don't remember the name of the company. I never knew the name of the CISO or the company that this was involved in. So, but this is scary. This is the state of business. And afterwards, in some of the conversation that I was having, people like, oh, you have no idea how bad it is. And we were talking about some of the issues related to cybersecurity that we have to deal with on a regular basis. The implications, a lot of the user accounts lack governance. Of course, this is very common. And now if you're talking about 443 accounts for every person, how do you create the right level of governance in your organization? There's too much that's going on. No surprise, but machine identities lack governance. And NHIs, they lack governance. How many are doing reviews and going through this whole process? It means that you've got a massive blind spot in your organization. Security, IT operations, AI, all of these types of things. These are big issues that need to be worked out. So enter cybersecurity. I am a cybersecurity person, so I'm going to look at it a little bit from a cybersecurity perspective. So identity is the new perimeter. There are lots of different cases, but this is from Palo Alto Networks, but from their data, 65% of initial access is driven by identity-based techniques. 65%. So you're seeing social engineering, credential use, misuse, et cetera. And I think that number is actually a lot higher. When you talk about reportability, if you have random hits, like let's say if you're a company that sells a lot of stuff and you have a portal people are logging into and it's sort of random because they're of password reuse and all these other things, or sometimes social engineering, that's not necessarily reportable. So I'm not 100% certain how they collected the data or what the details were, but I do know there are organized crime, like for example, Scattered Spider. Scattered Spider is very well known for going in and pretending to be part of social engineering. They'll call up and they'll say, hey, I'm so-and-so, I'm important. Can you go ahead and allow me to gain access? Oh, by the way, I don't have my phone with me. Can you go ahead and disable multi-factor authentication? And people, what do they want to do? Oh, that's a bigwig. Oh, I don't want to touch that bigwig. Let's go ahead and allow access. So you can see how it's broken. Now, in some of the cases that are out there, there's bigger issues that are going on, much bigger issues that are going on. And what happens is they do allow access that is going to cause problems for organization, but they don't even bother checking. They're supposed to check like, hey, can I get your employee ID number? Oh, it's on my card. I forgot it. And people get around it. And that creates an issue too, because then you're allowing unauthorized access into your organization. but the human desire to be helpful and the fear of being hit over the head is going to be very problematic. So when you bring in identity, it's a whole nother set of issues because now you've got AIs that are talking to AI, they're allowing agents, you've got shadow AI, you don't even know where some of the stuff is coming in through. It can be a big problem for organizations. So when you look at that, it's not just identity, it's all these other tools and things like that that are running amok that are non-deterministic, that we don't really know what's happening. And so when you look at these types of things, you can start to see where those problems arise. So let's switch over to the attackers. Of course, the attackers are leveraging automation and AI. Of course they are. It's making things speed up. Every CISO that I talk to is saying that numbers are going way up because the automation is just making it easier and easier to attack organizations. Now, only a few people had heard about the Anthropic incident. I'm going to talk about this at a really high level because I want to get back on track. But it's a good example. So China had come in and decided to use Anthropic to go hack other organizations. So they did all this work, all this preparatory work, and then they let AI run basically on its own, hacking organizations by utilizing AI because it's there to be helpful. Now they did catch it, they did stop it, but this just shows you that doing these types of attack is going to become easier and easier and easier because of all the AI that's available out there. So from the CrowdStrike Global Threat Report, AI-enabled adversaries increased attacks by 89% year over year. The average breakout time before they can start pulling stuff out, 29 minutes, which is 65% faster than last year. Whoa. Fastest, 27 seconds. Imagine as AI is adopted by more and more criminal organizations, by nation state actors, and so on. What is this going to be like next year? What are we going to be doing about it? How does all this fit into the big picture? Here's another interesting statistic as well. 82% of attacks are malware free. This means that identity is even more important than it was before. So let's get into what IT and security operations actually need. And the reality, and I'm painfully aware of this, IT is caught in the middle of all this, of course. You know, on one side, you're saying the business is saying faster, faster, faster. You've got AI, it should solve all your problems. Just run with it. Meanwhile, it's created a whole other set of problems that IT isn't able to handle. Then you got security saying, well, we need due diligence. We need to make sure we've configured it properly. IT people are torn. They're very, very busy. They don't want to do all the due diligence because they're saying faster, faster, faster. Meanwhile, you're not doing things more secure, more secure, more secure. You're ending up with organizations that have a ton of problems. So what IT needs? You need automation and visibility. One without the other makes no sense whatsoever. When you take a look at automation, if you don't have visibility to what you're automating, well, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. If you have visibility with automation, like, well, it's there, and you're not responding to it, that's equally a problem. That's actually worse. And this is true from an IT perspective and a cybersecurity perspective. So this particular picture I did take from some of the art, but it is on Vietnam. And I have been to Vietnam. I loved it when I was over there, but they have a lot of scooters and things like that all over. When you're dealing with traffic, you can sometimes find, you know, what could be a 20-minute trip might take 3 hours, especially if you're in a vehicle. You know, they have a lot of traffic. They don't have traffic lights. When you're walking out in front of the traffic lights, what do? You have to put your hand out and say, let's block it. And then you walk in front of the scooters, you know, as you've got these swarms and swarms of scooters that are around. These are operational bottlenecks. This is the metaphor that I'm going to go with. And the reality is manual investigations are extraordinarily slow, very, very slow. Teams have to switch between multiple tools. And this is true on IT and in cybersecurity. If you have to check 3 or 4 different things in order to correlate and go figure out what's going on between those systems, you're going to be very, very slow. And the same thing is true on the cybersecurity side. If you're trying to see all this stuff and trying to pull in all these different systems to figure out what's going on, that is a very slow bottleneck that's going to prevent you from responding to incidents fast. You know, we need to do something about this, especially when you see things are moving faster and faster. I shouldn't need to state this at this point, but I will. Alert volumes are exceeding human capacity. Responses cannot be made manually by people to stop the latest attacks. We can't. You know, if you're talking about 29 minutes, yeah, you could say, hey, pick up the phone, you find out what's going on, do some research. Oh, okay, this is happening, and you can respond. But let's say that 27 seconds. 27 seconds is how you're going to respond. You've picked up the phone. Oh, what's going on? Let me log into my account, and you figure out what's happening. That's problematic. You cannot be doing this on your own through manual processes for the most part, especially you think what's going to happen in 2027, what's going to happen in 2028. You need to start preparing to be more automated today. So for me, automation is a multiplier. And I'm going to talk about myself from a very, very long time ago. This is when I first started out in IT. I was doing a lot of Windows stuff. I will say I came from that world. And what I was doing is simple batch files. I had a lot of stuff I didn't want to do by hand, and I knew what was problematic and what wasn't. Clean it up every single day with a batch file. Cool. Great. We got all of that work done, and it saved time. Now, truth be told, I did have a detractor. You can't automate everything. We're going to be out of a job. Like, no, no, no. You're going to do some basic job, doing some automation, and you're going to be doing more important stuff because that's what I want you to focus on. So in the end, he ended up changing his mind. He started seeing the value of doing the automation from an IT perspective. But this is me 30 years ago as I'm starting to figure out how do I automate things as much as humanly possible using simple batch techniques. You know, that was a lifesaver for me. And it was a lifesaver for the organization because it made everything better, made everything more resilient. But the same can be true for all of you. You know, now we have far more powerful tools. There are things you can do from a scripting standpoint, things like that, that we couldn't have done 30 years ago. Much more powerful. And this is what's going to help you get from point A to point B and get the response times down, especially if you know these are standardized processes. You can't rely on just doing human, but you also have to make sure that you do have something that's relatively standardized. So what about visibility? You know, this is another big part of it here. Logs need to be centralized for analysis. If you don't have that centralization, how are you getting logs? And I do know there are types of systems out there that go and pull the logs, bring them back in. You know, you can do the analysis and kind of checking and going back and forth. There are systems that are out there. Now, I do know from a compliance standpoint, quite often that's not going to be sufficient. But if you're doing it on a regular basis every 5 minutes, and there's all kinds of things you can get into. But the main point is here, you need visibility. You know, what if it's related to a system and it's going down for whatever reason? That's a problem. Events need to be correlated. Correlation is very, very big. If you don't know what's happening between this and this, how are you going to even realize what's going on? You know, you have to be able to pinpoint it in your organization and see how it's related. How is that network device going to relate to a local machine if a machine possibly is compromised or something had come in or there's some kind of untoward behavior in your organization? Operational awareness. This goes back to my point that most companies don't have the full operational awareness of their organization. They don't know how the business is going to be impacted by certain events. You know, there are companies, they go out and they develop something. Hey, it's going to be up for 5 minutes. You know, in 5 minutes, if it goes down, we'll have it back up. It's like, you know, we can wait a week on that. We don't need something so big. You're talking about wasted resources. How much can you save? Because IT's thinking, I'm going to build the best possible thing of doing anything with good intent. These are not bad people. These are people trying to do the best job they can do, but you need a right size for the business. You know, if it can be up in a week from now, well, you know what? That's going to be very different than if you need 5 nines, if you need to be up all the time. You need to have some idea how the business thinks about the systems that they're working on. And the reality is, visibility enables decisions. Decisions are the key thing that you need to focus on. So really stop and think about it. This is true from an IT perspective and a cybersecurity perspective. I don't care which side of the house you're on, you need visibility. You need to understand how the business looks at things, who to contact, and what that whole process is going to look like. Visibility does enable decisions. It's very, very critical. So let's get to SIM a little bit. Now, I do come from this background as well. I have looked at a lot of different SIMs over the years. I have looked at SOCs. I have looked at all kinds of things. But from a cartoonish perspective, this is what a SIM is. Aggregation, aggregation of logs. Correlation, like we spoke about before, but intelligence. And this means a lot of things. I talk about things from a business intelligence standpoint because you need to understand the business environment, but there's also threat intelligence. That's the other side of the equation that has to be taken into account. Intelligence is absolutely critical. Then you need to look at things like analytics. How are you analyzing all this stuff, putting it all together to make coherent information? Then you need to give that information out through alerts. And so there's a whole process that's going to be going on at that level that's a little bit more complicated. So I did talk about this stuff. You can detect abnormal activity and those sorts of things. But a SIM is kind of foundational from a cybersecurity perspective. You might be using even some types of SIMs that are out there that work both for IT and security. That's one of the issues. Sometimes what you do is with a firewall, you can split the logs to 2 different locations. And that can be a huge win for companies. So let's take a look a little bit at that SOC. The SIM is kind of stage 1. The SOC is stage 2. This is where you get the people involved and, hey, we need to do this or this is related to that. And you're going to be doing some work. Now, automation of the SOC, as much as humanly possible, is going to be very helpful, but you want to be careful with that. There is one organization I'm aware of. They started doing some work with automation and they didn't bother telling IT operations about the issue. Well, you can imagine the problem in the organization because there was no communication. But you put all this together, this is one part of business resilience. It's not everything, but this is an important part. These are your jobs. All of you are IT and cybersecurity people. This is part of your job to do. You need to make sure that you're resilient. So identity processes. Now, one of the stories I like to tell is from many years ago. It was a different context, but basically it took me 2 months to get the managers to say, hey, let's take a look at this. Let's find out what those problems are. Let's see, because I'm seeing a lot of things that makes me scratch my head. And I scratch my head a lot. That's why I'm bald. Being a little facetious there. But eventually we got around to doing it. What he found out was, after looking at the data, people who hadn't worked at the organization for 15 years had access. 15 years! You have to look at this stuff. Remember how I said we don't have good governance of a lot of our processes? And you might have some basic governance and process, and you're looking through some things. But unless you're going through and checking this stuff on a regular basis, you need to have a full identity process in place. This is not just good governance, it's good due diligence, it's good assurance, it's good validation that the processes are working well. And I've been in organizations where I've come in, did a review in one part of the section, and they were doing brilliant. And I want to give them full credit where credit is due. But other organizations and other parts might be very problematic. So you might find like, this is our problem area. This is where we're going to need to do a deep dive to figure out this stuff. That's part of the identity processes. And from my perspective, identity improves life. That's what automation does. You're able to pull that information out so you don't have to sit down and think about it. You write your script, go grab the information, you have the output, you take a look at it, and you're like, that's pretty good. And it standardizes things. Automation improves it from that standpoint, so you're getting good quality information. Very valuable, very, very valuable if you're working in any type of organization. Automation makes your life better, and then you're able to go work with the other people, just like that person who was the naysayer on automation kind of realized the value, and he was doing more interesting work in this particular case. So definitely you need to consider automation. It's going to multiply the amount of work that you're able to do. Now, in every organization I've been in, it's possible there could be an exception out there somewhere. IT operations is larger than security operations. I just take that as a foundational truth about reality itself. But, there's an element where they have to intersect. When you talk about something called SOAR, if you're not familiar with it, it's security orchestration automation response, where you find something and maybe you stop something. Like, for example, if you see something out of a SOC, you might say, great, we know what this is coming from. We can see an attack. Let's go ahead and block it. But you need a human in the middle. So yes, you might be able to do that, but what are the implications of that? So for example, if you are selling to the general public, there's something out there called a carrier grade NAT, carrier grade network address translation. So behind this carrier grade NAT, you might have one IP address, but a million IPs behind it, and maybe you've got a million people trying to connect into your particular system. Maybe it's 500,000, whatever. But you don't want to block that carrier grade NAT because you're going to be blocking legitimate traffic. So you have to be very careful about the approach. And I'm being a little bit simplistic with some of the stuff. And I know that there are nuances and things like that that you can do, but you have to be very careful. You need some judgment in there for what are the processes that you're going to set up. But security and IT operations have to work together. You have to make sure that they're aware of what's going on and are they okay with the automation and that we accept this is what's going to happen. You have to get that communication going in the right way. So an ounce of prevention, I have a slight fooling that I'm doing here, is a pound of cure. Well, I'm looking at his resilience. An ounce of prevention is absolutely critical, but that prevention is going to help create a more resilient organization. Your organization is going to be better off because you started to do the automation, you started to do all these other things, your prevention is going to be better. So this is really critical to think about as you start to go through it. But technology does mean supporting the business. I am a very business-oriented person. I'm going to think from an ROI perspective. What is the ROI that you're doing in support of the business? What's that cost going to be like? Like I sometimes run GRC circles, for example, for another company. And what's interesting in these GRC circles is most companies know when it comes to like things like AI agents, they're not ready. I kind of joked once, what's your business continuity plan look like? Are you encompassing AI and AI agents? And the response was no. Almost across the board. No, everybody knew. I mean, I knew that was a bad question to ask because I knew companies are not paying attention to details like that because it's just too much. And then people are going to go screaming if an incident occurs. Hey, I need the system up and running. I had this set up perfectly. And now they've got to go through and get things reset up from an AI agent perspective. So even getting up to speed with where companies were, this can take a long period of time. But you've got to make sure that you're doing what the business needs in the order, in the alignment that are actually needed. Now, I do recognize that there are a lot of problems over on the business side of the house. Most business leaders aren't necessarily trained to know how to communicate with IT. And IT isn't trained to look at others. So part of what I do is I try to create some communication between the two. And that means a lot of different things from risk communication to others, but it also means that it's getting everybody on the same page through those communication processes. One potential customer I was looking at, the question on their mind was, so what? The IT people would be speaking geek, and then the business people like, what? Who cares? What? So what? What does it matter? And they couldn't answer. And they'd sit there, and this would be highly problematic. So we need a new operating model. We need an operating model where we're communicating better across the board, but also means security and IT are working together, but also means the business is involved as well. Without that business, you're going to be backwards. Now, here's part of the problem. Like you go to the National Association of Corporate Directors, they do recommend you talk to one another. When I give some of the talks, I sometimes will ask questions on things. And what I've seen is there are certain companies that are doing a much better job because they got the communication in place. So that's really valuable. And the companies make more profit when you've got this communication. Now, it might be annoying to you, it might be problematic to you, but at least you've got the conversation going. So, this is the model we should be going for, what we should be aiming for. But typically, you don't see that in modern corporations. So then I asked a little bit on non-product questions, but we'll skip that for today. But I want to thank you very much for paying attention to this, and hopefully you got some value out of this. And I look forward to seeing everybody soon. Thank you so much. Bye bye.